Welcome back to the Zero Lab. Today we are going to be taking a look at Giratina VSTAR in the upcoming Temporal Forces format. Obviously, Temporal Forces is legal now on PTCG Live, and we've started to see some online tournament results in the format, and we'll be taking a look at some of Giratina's matchups later in this video, as we also are going to be going over what seems to be a common list for Giratina VSTAR in this format. The first thing to note, though, is that Giratina VSTAR does lose some important cards to the rotation, and we'll be going over a couple of those here quickly. Obviously, we lose Battle VIP Pass, which was great for not only finding our Comfies on turn 1, but also finding our Giratina Vs, as well as our Greninja and our Cramorant. Now we have Buddy Buddy Poffin, which is good for finding our Comfies, but doesn't really find us our Tina Vs and our Radiant Greninja. The other thing that Giratina loses to the rotation is Path to the Peak. Path to the Peak was often combined with Roxanne and Counter Catcher to make some great comeback plays at the end of the game for Giratina, as it would sort of go down on the prize trade and then try to disrupt the opponent as much as possible to come back from a losing position. With Path to the Peak gone, you aren't able to shut off your opponent's abilities, and so you don't have as much comeback potential in this upcoming format. The other thing that Giratina VSTAR loses is Escape Rope. Escape Rope was always a good card in Lost Zone decks. If your opponent was trying to hide something on their bench, you could use Escape Rope and then hit it with the Cramorant on your turn 1 if they only had one Ralts or one Frigibax, depending on what matchup you're going into. Escape Rope was a really good card, and Giratina also loses that. There are a few things, however, that Giratina does gain from the new set. The first thing is that Rescue Board, which is a tool card that you can attach to one of your Pokemon to give it one less retreat cost. Obviously, we're going to want to use that on one of our Comfies and always have that free pivot. And then, obviously, we do gain the Buddy Buddy Poffins and Prime Catcher as a very good A-Spec card in the Giratina deck. There's also the Iron Leaves EX, which is really only usable into matchups like Charizard EX, but is a very strong attacker in that matchup, obviously being able to one-shot a Charizard EX. So we'll take a look at this deck list here. This seems to be the standard way that Giratina players are choosing to build this deck in this format. I think there could be some variation here and there, but this seems to be sort of the standard 60 that is coming to be settled on. So here we obviously have 4 Comfy, a 3/3 Giratina VSTAR, 1 Sableye, Cramorant, 1 Iron Leaves EX, and 1 Radiant Greninja, and 1 Manaphy. Now, something to note is maybe in previous formats, Giratina VSTAR wouldn't always play that Manaphy. That wasn't super common. It wasn't uncommon, but it was nice to save that spot when needed. However, with the rise of Chien-Pao being a very strong deck in the next format, much stronger than I think it was in the past format, that Manaphy seems to be really necessary to keep them from taking 2 prizes with a 1 prizer in that Radiant Greninja. Then for the support accounts, we have 4 Colress's Experiment, 2 Boss's Orders, 2 Roxanne. Pretty similar to last format. Sometimes some decks would weave in 1 or 2 Iono here or there. However, I do think that playing Pokegears to find your Colress might be a little bit better than playing the Iono. For Nest Ball, obviously we don't have VIP Pass anymore to find our Giratina Vs and our Radiant Greninja, so maxing out the counts of Nest Ball seems very good. For Mirage Gate, 3 Switch Cart and 1 Switch, so a 3-1 split on the Switch Cart and Switch. I do think that you could go to a 2-2 split. It is very nice to be able to switch out your Giratina VSTAR from the active with that switch. Obviously, you can't use Switch Cart on Giratina VSTAR. However, you still do have the 4 Jet Energies to move it out of the active as well. So I don't think that's a big deal, and maybe it does help improve your Lost Box matchup as well as the Mirror match a little bit as players start to move damage around with those Sableyes. Then we have 2 Super Odd, 2 Buddy Buddy Poffin. I could see increasing the counts of Buddy Buddy Poffin. You really want to get your Comfies out. However, they just really are useless once you have 2 or 3 Comfies out. So if you played 3 or 4, you're using up a lot of deck space to just devote to finding your Comfies. And we do play an Artisan as well. So maybe there's enough search in here to keep that Buddy Buddy Poffin count just at the 2. Then we have 1 Counter Catcher, 1 Prime Catcher. Both great gusting options. Counter Catcher can only be used when you're behind on prizes, and Prime Catcher can be used whenever and is also an additional switching effect, which is nice. Then one Pokegear, again, I think that's good to dig for your Colress. I think where Giratina can really falter is those games where you're not chaining your Colress's experiments. So as long as you can keep finding those Colress in the early game to build up that Lost Zone, the deck functions a lot better. One thing we're seeing in Tina lists in this new format is the Lost Vacuum. Lost Vacuum can help us get to that 7 in the Lost Zone number a lot quicker. We can vacuum away our own Rescue Board or our Artisan or our Forest Sealstone, which we'll get to here in a minute. And that just is 2 additional cards in the Lost Zone, which can help us to get to that 7 number a lot quicker. Then we play the one switch, 1 Forest Sealstone. I think a lot of people are curious as to why Giratina is playing the Forest Sealstone in this format. Obviously, don't you want to use the Star Requiem V-Star power? Well, in a lot of matchups, yes, you do want to use that, but there are certain matchups where you really don't need to use that, and so the Forest Sealstone can add a lot of consistency. As well as, in past days when we had like the Turbo Lost Zone decks, you can Forest Sealstone for the vacuum to vacuum away the Forest Sealstone, get yourself to that 7 number, and start attacking. So it does add a lot of consistency to the deck. Obviously, if you can't find your Colress, you can Forest Sealstone for it as well. So there's a lot of uses for it in the matchups where Star Requiem isn't as useful. Then we have the Rescue Board to give free retreat to our Comfies, 1 Artisan to find more basic Pokemon, 4 Grass Energy, 4 Jet Energy, 3 Water Energy, and 3 Psychic Energy. And the reason we're playing more Grass Energy than the other colored energies is because of that Iron Leaves, which has the ability that when you play it from your hand to your bench, you can move any amount of energy to it and move it to the active position, and then you can one-shot a Charizard EX, which is very nice. Overall, I think this deck list looks pretty solid. I don't think there's a lot of changes that I would personally make to it. And I think that Tina still is a fairly strong deck, but I think it really is hurt by the loss of Path to the Peak. I think you really relied in a lot of games on that Roxanne Path turn to disrupt your opponent and shut off their abilities. And now that you can't do that, it's harder to come from behind than it was before. And there's just a few decks in the format that I feel have very favorable matchups into Giratina V-Star that makes it lower on my list of good decks in the Temporal Forces format. Now we can head over to Limitless here, where we have had some online tournaments occurring in this format, and we can take a look at Giratina's win rate against some of these more popular decks. Now, take this with a grain of salt. People are still learning how to play these decks. People are still learning how to build some of these newer decks, and so these win rates I don't think would be exactly accurate if you had the best player playing one deck versus the best player playing Tina V-Star with the optimal 60 of both lists. Would that win rate be the same as we're seeing here? Probably not. And so I'll try to talk about some of that as we go through these. So starting with Charizard, Giratina V-Star has a win rate of 63% into Charizard decks. There's been a total of 60 matches of Giratina versus Charizard. Now, Giratina had a pretty good win rate into Charizard in the past already, but I think a big part of that was that Path to the Peak. Obviously, the Iron Leaves does help now, but I actually don't expect the win rate if you had the best Charizard player versus the best Tina player. I'm not sure that that win rate would be that high. I do think that it would probably be closer to about the 55% win rate, at least in my testing. For EUIC, it just seems like maybe Giratina still favored. The Iron Leaves does help a lot. You still have the Star Requiem. But the Mist Energy in Charizard decks can cause some issues, and I just don't see the win rate being that high. Now, the Future Hands deck obviously has some consistency issues of its own. Currently, it looks like Tina has a 56% win rate into Future Hands. Again, Future Hands is one of those decks that people are learning how to build right now, and so maybe that win rate would be lower as soon as people are figuring out the optimal way to build Future Hands. I do think a tough thing for Tina is the Future Hands can one-shot the Tina Vs with Arm Press, depending on how many modifiers they have in play with those Iron Crown EXs. However, the disruption in the late game, if the Future Hands does not have a gift energy on its attacker, a Roxanne plus KO can spell the end of the game for that Turbo Hands player. And I think the other thing that gives Tina the edge in this matchup is playing the Lost Vacuum. The Iron Hands deck really likes to have the heavy baton to keep its energies in play, and if you can get rid of that heavy baton when you KO the first Iron Hands, it can mean that they're almost completely out of energy and really relying on their generator hits to power up another attacker. So I do think that that win rate does make sense for Tina. Obviously, future hands can be really aggressive in the early game, and if they were to get like the turn 1 Iron Hands KO on a comfy or something, then I think Tina would fall maybe too far behind. But like I said, that lost vacuum on the heavy baton could make a real difference in that matchup. Now, Lugia Archeops, there's only been 31 matches played of this matchup, but currently it's saying 51% win rate for Giratina, and I think that is absolutely bonkers. I think that Lugia Archeops is incredibly favored into Giratina VSTAR, at least 55%, if not 60% favored to Lugia Archeops. So I think that this win rate should be about 40% for Giratina. Excuse me. I think with the missed energies in the V-Guards and Lugia, it's incredibly difficult for Giratina to one-shot a Lugia V-Star when it gets going, and then the Cinchinos can one-shot the Giratina V-Stars as they set up. And Lugia Archeops, I think, is a lot more consistent than people thought at the start of the format, or, you know, before the format started and we were seeing lists from Japan. I think people thought the Lugia Archeops would be a lot more inconsistent than it's turning out to be. So I do think that Giratina is very unfavored into Lugia. Moving on to Chien-Pao Baxcalibur, with 31 matches, about a 30% win rate for Giratina, and that makes sense to me. I think this is another matchup that is very unfavored for Lost Zone Giratina. One of the things I think that makes it very unfavored is not only the ability of Chien-Pao to be essentially playing as a one prize deck, attacking with Greninja to take 2 on comfies, and then only bringing out your Chien-Pao when you're going to take a knockout on the Giratina V-Star. Chien-Pao being able to play as a one prize deck, using the Radiant Greninja to take 2 prizes on comfies, and then bringing out the Chien-Pao only once you're going to take 2 prizes on a Giratina, and then the ability to use Iron Hands as well to take another 2 prizes just makes that matchup very good for Chien-Pao. Giratina is seeming to be 63% favored into Arceus Giratina. I think that makes sense. I think that was always somewhat of a tough matchup for the Arceus decks, and it seems to remain that way. And then finishing off with a couple of other decks, Snorlax Stall, Giratina's always been favored into. Great Tusk Mill, another control type deck I think Giratina is favored into. Then Lost Zone Box, I think is actually a very even matchup, and that's what we're seeing in the data, although there aren't a lot of matches with it yet. So overall, I think Giratina has a pretty good matchup spread. I think 2 decks where it's pretty unfavored is that Lugia Archeops and Chien-Pao Baxcalibur. But I do expect Giratina V-Star to still be a very strong deck in this upcoming format. I expect a lot of people who enjoyed Giratina V-Star in the last format to still play it in this upcoming format, despite the fact that I do feel like it's weaker, and I think 2 of the top decks in the format, it takes a pretty unfavorable matchup to in that Lugia and the Chien-Pao. So we'll see how Giratina does at EUIC, and I hope this video was helpful to you. If it was, leave a like, comment, subscribe, and we will see you in the next video.